Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stewart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 49, Foreseeing New Frontiers, Integrating Novel Instruments, Creating Unprecedented Value. A study of the interplay of effort, nous, risk, grit, value, worth, and wealth.
What if I told you of the grandson of a peasant writing a letter in 1500s Europe to the most powerful man in the continent, if not the world, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany, and bit more, King of Spain, and thus of the vast Spanish dominions in the Americas, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and some small change, of this son of Weaver, writing this letter to the emperor telling him, "You wouldn't be emperor without me, so now better pay up the debts you owe me." This is the story we'll be following today as part of the advent of the early modern era, of the shift from power coming from land, bloodlines and armies, to commerce, business, and banking.
But this is still also a story of technology. So let's apply our technocentric view to dig out the innovations and achievements which happen to be relevant to us to this day.
Let's first set the stage on how things were in the mid to late 1400s, in addition to much of what I've covered in the 40s decade of this series, especially the last couple of them, episode 47 and episode 48, so we can then appreciate the juicy detail of what came next. So yes, let's go back to Renaissance Italy. As I've said before, we associate this time and period with art, but I trust I've shown, especially in episode 43, episode 44, and episode 45, alongside the other two just mentioned, that the Italian city-states of this period were pioneers in a great many other disciplines, such as engineering. Today's topic flows from another big achievement of theirs, banking. In fact, we get the word bank, a word almost universally used and not just in English, from the Italian, where it initially meant bench, also cognate. Just imagine Giuseppe sat on a bench offering money-changing services. What do you call your business, signore? Dunno. A bench?
Counting on counts, banking on kings.
But by the late 1400s, the Italian banking system, despite the huge advancements it had made in the field, which I will come to as relevant, was starting to strain. The biggest setback was sovereign default. I mean, would you lend your money in late medieval Europe? Or elsewhere, for that matter, I guess. To a count, duke, or a king, a head of state. For if he doesn't pay back, what are you going to do? Send the bailiffs, ones under his employ? Take him to court, the one run by the king? But that was the mistake some of the great Italian banks made, leading them on the road to bankruptcy. And oh, by the way, more juicy etymology. The word bankrupt literally refers to that bench being broken, ruptured. Sovereign lending in itself was not the entire story, though, as we'll come to see. But it is in this febrile atmosphere that, from the southern German lands into Venice, enters a 14-year-old kid, Jakob Fugger.
Business as usual.
But before we meet the Fuggers, let's take a quick look at some of those Italian issues or innovations, because it matters to how these were resolved or integrated by young Jake. The biggest bone of contention was the Catholic Church's ban on usury, charging interest against money lent. This prohibition, which today can be argued as economically absurd, for some reason held much sway, so much so that church officials would actively pursue and persecute anyone on the faintest suspicion of this heinous act. It said church officials would dig graves of usury suspects and show people the worms on the decomposing body as proof of their usurial sins. This also explains why Jews were big in the money-lending business and were thus hated for becoming rich off it, a contributing factor to Judophobia as epitomized in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. The ingenious innovation they developed to work around this was the bill of exchange. This is very roughly analogous to paper currency, which we take for granted, but such instruments were very novel or not obvious at that time, at least in Europe. Church says no to interest. Giovanni, cracking knuckles, hold my Chianti. This was a kind of two birds with one stone solution. Firstly, it obviated the need to carry huge amounts of coins when traveling to another land to do your trading, and thereby exposing yourself to bandits or even, it being a different jurisdiction, to ad hoc and opportunistic tolls. No, not trolls, but perhaps just as annoying. But beyond that, think of these bills in fact as a traveler's check, because it's specifically designed to work across currency regions. Here's the gist of how it worked. Trader obtains a BOE from branch in region A in currency X and produces it to affiliated branch in region B using currency Y. Here's the kicker. Trader does not get the exact equivalent cash at destination, but a slightly smaller amount, the cut amounting not only to a profit for the service, but also disguised interest. The bill of exchange was thus at the same time a payment mechanism, a credit instrument, and a usury workaround, all in one elegant contractual form. And did I say it was bandit-proof? So, this is an example of the type of issues and innovations that had already emerged. There were a few more key ones in solving problems such as maritime trade risk, banking networks, etc., the technical detail of which I'll leave in the footnotes here.
From weft to heft, deftly.
And yes, this is when our emperor challenger finally comes in. It all starts with the grandfather, Hans Fuder, who arrived in the South German town of Augsburg as a weaver and an immigrant, and rose up the ranks, obtained citizenship, married well, and added merchant to his title rather than just a weaver. Hans's younger son, Jakob the Elder, did even better, expanding the trade, again marrying well, become a director of the Weavers' Guild, going on to become the 12th richest man in the city. This dynastic and kinship references are relevant because businesses back then were very much family and kinship affairs, and thus one other detail that merits mention is that the elder Jakob had many sons, the older ones being who set the stage for the banking-related business when Jakob was still a teenage apprentice in Venice. But when Jakob returned from Venice after this 14-year stint, i.e., half his life, he was a changed man. He'd absorbed all of the knowledge and skills of the Italian banking industry and determined to make his mark by taking things even further.
Imperial measures.
Let's get the emperor story sorted first. The Fugger brothers' first loan was to a certain Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol, an extravagant ruler always in debt, in the year 1487. The same year Jakob returned from his apprenticeship for a modest sum of 3,000 florins. But here's what they did differently from the Italian bankers of yore. They secured the right to purchase silver at a fixed below-market price, 5 guilders per pound against 8. And that guaranteed 3 guilder difference, technically a spread, generated a return of 50,000 guilders in just 18 months. And this is a model they would go on to scale until Jakob would take it to the hilt, helping elect the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The so-called Holy Roman Empire was a loose confederation of semi-autonomous, or even practically autonomous, states and principalities, and the office of the emperor, which was again a bit of a figurehead, was not hereditary, but chosen by around the so-called electors or prince-electors, 7 in all. Unlike what we may expect, this election was a pure exercise of bribing the electors. He who outbribed his rival candidate became emperor. Simple as that. And in 1519, When Maximilian I died, he had two main contenders, his grandson Charles of Spain and Francis I of France, who was the favorite, even endorsed by the Pope. King Henry VIII of England was a brief contender too, but left the scene early. Probably he had other more important things to do, like browsing profiles on Match.com. And the Fuggers were already invested in the House of Habsburg, so Charles it was going to be. And here's the whopper. The total cost of the election, cough cough, fiscal persuasion, was about 852,000 guilders, of which the Fugger firm contributed 544,000 guilders, about 64%, roughly 1,425 kilograms of gold. So I guess now you can see why Jakob Fugger had the audacity to write the multi-kingdom collecting emperor himself, a pay-up-or-else note, and get away with it. Well, going beyond this obscene story, we can still find some nuggets of gold, some takeaways in our story of innovation.
The price of value.
With the advent of a change in some artifactual technology, there arises the opportunity for massive value creation, on a scale unimaginable before. We saw this, for example, in the story of the printing press in episode 42. With hindsight, it's easy for us to look back at any such breakthrough and rapid change. But as I've often said, hindsight is a trap. People living through the early days do not necessarily see the potential opportunities lurking right around the corner. It takes a certain nous to do so. Of course, there's also the counterpoint to it when some folk overdo this in the other direction by building up hype about a new technology. I'm sure we all recognize this in our own present day only too well. Those few who, apart from being at the right place at the right time with the right means, a contingency sadly not all of us can ensure for ourselves, see such small sparks of opportunity and build a beacon out of it, will come out on top, doing massively well for themselves. In our own times, we have examples of these such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Elon Musk. Back around 1450 to 1500, which I have noted as the period of transition from the medieval to the early modern era, Jakob Fugger is one such towering case. He, like few others, had the perspicacity to see and foresee, but also, very importantly, take the massive amounts of risk required to pull it off. As you can imagine, in the example of lending to kings and emperors, you're risking all your property, even your life itself. Here are a couple of innovations Jakob Fugger brought about that showcase this pioneering spirit. He established paid reporters across much of Europe who would send him reports of the goings-on in the local area, not just in an economic or business-related sense, but also the wider political and other areas, which could be of relevance. The King of France coughed blood today. It was sort of the Bloomberg terminal of the day, but private. And he made sure he procured this intel and acted on such much before anyone else did and could. Perhaps even more importantly for posterity, he further improved on the accounting practices I discussed the utility of in the previous piece, episode 48. He systematized and perfected the double-entry bookkeeping system, whereby, in a single financial statement, Fugger could get a full understanding of all the business across his vast financial empire, from Augsburg to Amsterdam, from Venice to Budapest, from Antwerp to Leipzig, of every single transaction, of every asset, liability, and surplus, to the last penny. Also, check out this footnote about some of Jakob Fugger's charity work, subsidized social housing he built, where, to this day, the price of an apartment is around $1. A popular notion of wealth is its association with greed, but as I've outlined, and is a point we'll return to at every new moment of technological breakthrough, each such event brings about such first movers who, before others catch up, generate such massive new value that they end up becoming wealthy beyond what most of us can imagine. And as I hope I've demonstrated in the previous piece, value creation is not zero-sum. It's not a rob Peter to Paul type of thing. It is genuinely creating something new. It is innovation. Here, let's say, Jacob baked a much bigger pie than anyone ever had. And of course, high amounts of wealth, as we have seen in this very piece, tend to go hand in hand with power. And from there, to trying to control the market, suppress new players, and influencing the state legal apparatus to pass laws in your favor to the detriment of potential competitors, and ultimately to consumers and wider society. There was a fair share of the discussion of such machinations in Jakob Fugger's time and ever since. I'm sure many of us reading the story of Fugger are reminded of Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, with some wanting to add more recent names, such as Zuckerberg. How do we ensure a system where new value can be created, and the value creators, given all the risk they take, efforts they expend, dogged determination they demonstrate, can be adequately compensated and seen so by the rest of society, so we can encourage more innovators to step up? Equally, how do we ensure the system restrains such huge achievers from exploiting their early market dominance in ways I've outlined above? These are but questions still burningly relevant to us to this day.